Just in case, I want to take this moment to make sure listeners are aware that early bird pricing for my online yoga teacher training is available until October 1st. If you feel like you learned something from the show, or you connect with the way that I engage in these conversations, and you're looking for a learning opportunity to delve deeper into your own understanding of yoga, or develop a teaching practice, or maybe you already have a teaching practice and you're looking for new information, then my year-long program might be the perfect thing. A new group is starting in January, and I do think the program is different than a lot of others out there. It is truly co-creative. It's designed to fit to your needs rather than you having to jump through a bunch of arbitrary hoops. By far, it is the most comprehensive offering I've ever put together. And if you register before October 1st, you can get 50% off. To learn more about the program and register, go to jbrownyoga.com/training. That's jbrownyoga.com/training. Okay, I just pushed my button, you just pushed your button. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome if this is your first time here. All the rest of y'all, what's up? How are we feeling today? Can you feel it? Can you feel that turn of the season happening? We're in that late summer with the hint of fall, if not already kind of fall upon us. I always like that feeling of the momentum takes over a little bit. When life's momentum starts to pick up after a bit of a slowdown, you know? Gotta ride that wave and see if we can make some use of ourselves in it. At least that's where I am at. I don't know how you're doing. I must admit that I have been feeling like with this turn of season, something's been brewing in the yoga circles. Like I'm starting to get that old feeling of zeitgeist of, oh, yoga teachers are starting to get back out there in new ways, and we have settled into something different than was before. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were saying, are we going back to doing things the way we were before? And then we were all saying, no way, there's no way we could ever go back. Well, that's for sure true. And it does feel like we're settling into what is the new landscape. And I think the biggest marker for me is that the scale is all just reduced down. People aren't looking at the biggest numbers that they were looking at before. We haven't returned to the same number of people in classes that we had before. And of course, there's now the online classes, which continues and in some cases replaced the in-person. But I mentioned last week that I did my first in-person workshop this last weekend with the YTA in Hudson Valley, New York. It was fantastic. Shout out to anybody who was at the workshop who's listening. It felt like no time had passed. It really felt good. And the conversation I had with those teachers had to do with a pedagogical shift that's been taking place in the yoga world. And that is the topic of conversation today with my guest, Nikki Costello, who, as you will learn, I had never really met in any kind of real way up until this conversation. I mean, we had met as acquaintances and many mutual friends over the years, but this is the longest, maybe only conversation I've ever really had with Nikki. As we look back over the last 30 years of being yoga teachers in parallel, and I noticed that she was facilitating this group called Reimagining the Classroom. And the description she wrote for it and what I heard about it seemed to really be another indication of this shift that I've been observing, and I think is interesting to see if we can, put some words to. So it was a real pleasure to connect with Nikki and compare notes, and I'm glad to be sharing our conversation with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I want to say thanks to Podcast Premium subscribers, specifically today, Joshua Farrow and Monica Haskell. Shout out to you, Joshua and Monica, for supporting the show. If you're new around here and you didn't know, the last 52 episodes of the show are always part of our free public feed. We do also offer a premium subscription, which is the way to access the full archives and just support the show. It's choose your rate, cancel at any time. And if you don't have money and there's an old episode that you want to listen to, all you have to do is email us and we will definitely give you a free account. But if you can give even just little something, it makes a huge difference. It's really the way that we keep the podcast going. And we're just incredibly grateful to everyone who supports us in this way. To learn more about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, as well as all of my other stuff, go to jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I think that's good. I am going to touch base with you on the other side, but we've got lots to get to, so let's do that. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Nikki Costello. Hello? Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. I just had my, I switched from my AirPods to my microphone. How does this sound?
Sounds fine to me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. It's lovely to be with you, and I feel really honored that you wanted to include me and have this.
I'm glad to have this moment with you too. And I am already recording, and if it's okay, I usually like to just consider us having just begun, if that's all right with you.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Very cool. Well, I was thinking as I was sitting here, I don't really know you at all because I've never hung out with you or really sat down and having a conversation with you, but I feel like I know you. And it's because I have all of these memories of seeing you somewhere or being involved in something that you were involved with at all of these signposts over what I was figuring out is essentially 30 years at this point.
Amazing.
And so it's I know you, but I don't know you at all. But what's so significant to me is that there's not many people I remember from that far back who are sort of still at it in a way. I often refer to them on the show as lifers.
That's that's just wonderful. I actually had a similar feeling about you and have always over the years, known that you were there, and whether it's, whether we shared students or situations where we had the opportunity to cross paths in that way, your presence is known. It's like that feeling of someone's in the field. You just know they're in the field. They're there. You're calling them lifers, and I'm like, well, we're in the field and we're doing this together. And
right.
Here we are. Well, any particular signposts that you mentioned this?
Yes, I remember earliest memories probably just being in class at Jivamukti on 2nd Avenue in 92 or 93 or something like that. You were taking classes there regularly, if I recall. So was I.
Absolutely.
So absolutely. I just think we were in a bunch of classes together. So I have all those memories. And then fast forward a while, and I was kind of like a senior teacher at Go Yoga, and Kula opened up a place in Brooklyn. And I just remember from around then some gatherings that happened or whatever. We were at them together. I remember being introduced to you or saying hi to you at one point or another. And then I remember, fast forward from there was like a panel discussion that I think we were on about hands-on adjustments. I think Nikki Costello was there too. And so just again, like along the way. And that actually brings me exactly to why I reached out to you. And I think I might have mentioned this to you in an email, but for everybody listening too, I was listening to Nikki Costello talk with Jacob Kyle on his podcast about the state of Kula and just like kind of like where things are at in the yoga world. And that's always a conversation I'm interested in, especially now because everything got so obliterated and nobody seems to know because everybody's so siloed. But she mentioned participating in a class with you that I believe you entitled Reimagining the Classroom or something like that. And it just sounded like the conversation you were having is one that I've been having a lot too, which has to do with what seems to me a pretty big shift in the way teachers relate to students and like just yoga pedagogy in general, in terms of like where the power is and the like invitational language versus like one right way to do it. And just a lot of conversations that seem to, in my mind, I suspicion that it's happened across like all the different traditions as well. Like it's not specific to one style of practice or tradition, that they all seem to have evolved. I even remember having some conversations with Carrie Owerko and with Hong Gui Suk, I believe, another Iyengar teacher, about more somatic approaches within the Iyengar tradition, So it's sort of a conversation that's been going on for a while, but I feel like even after the last 2 years, more than ever before, even just in terms of the way people are using online teaching more than ever before, it has really changed. And so just to me, that we have paralleled each other for so many years. And I often say, and I think you might be in the same group, like I came into my adulthood alongside yoga going into the mainstream. And so there's all these parallels between like my own personal evolution and the way things happened, like in the quote unquote industry or whatever too. So I just feel like we've been kind of cruising along and having similar evolutions. And now you're having the same conversation because it seems like you've evolved as a teacher as well, as many of us have. And I find that very intriguing. So that's maybe an introduction for anybody listening and for you as to what I think brings us together now after all these years.
I love this moment, right? Like how can we so appreciate that we've actually arrived in a place that is allowing us to have the conversation, to have the dialogue that can retrospectively look back 30 years, that can, where we as, co-seekers, co-students, in this, as I said, we're like in it together. We've been in the field, co-collaborating and not even knowing that we are, because we're in it and because we've been in it for decades. And I think the beauty of recognizing oneself as a teacher, right? I mean, I was asked to teach and had no idea that I would be a teacher and that teaching would be a life path. I did recognize that the practice of yoga really like deep resonance and realization that I am a learner, right? Like, and I love understanding who I am through this lens, through these tools, through these practices. So it was a great revelation, as you speak of, in the early 90s, when we were at Jivamukti, that as I remember that place, it is a sacred abode of like my own like coming into being. And I really, I truly feel that way. And that's really an important part, I think, of the context of looking back and then being where we are and looking forward. which is there are so many things in our dialogue and in our conversation right now that weren't topics then. And there's something beautiful about having a certain kind of innocence and naivete and, coming to the practice as a seeker and it really just being about me, right? Like, this is really just about me. This is really just about the fact that I'm in my early 20s. I'm in New York City. I'm in a community of what was mostly artists and
tattooed freaks, a bunch of tattooed freaks.
I was going to say, like, all of the above who could practice yoga pretty much any hour of the day at the time because our vocations or occupations or the way we were engaging in the world didn't, allowed us the space to kind of go in and do this thing. And when I consider now, how has the conversation changed? What is it that is relevant? What is significant right now? I really understand it's the responsibility of teaching. It's the teacher as carrier or holder of a lineage or an experience of being in something for 30 years, and I'm not going to just limit that to a particular lineage, but how many of us arrive at the place where we say, I've been doing this for 30 years, I've been at this. So let's just situate time as an important factor that changes the dialogue or introduces, what's relevant now as one thing. The other is that if we look back to be here now, to look forward, when I was practicing at Jivamukti, to find out more, right? To find out more, to know the name of an asana, to know the name of a guru or a master that was, pictured on the wall. We had to do the effort of
to find somewhere to get the information.
We had to find somewhere, yeah, exactly. And it was such an interesting place, an interesting time where resourcing was collaborative in a really interesting way. It's like
by necessity, because you had to do it. There was no training programs, there was no online, so it was just what you could find at the library or what you could get from picking the brain of a teacher or asking a question.
That's right. And that's it. That's it. What did you get from asking a question? I remember being in class and having to answer questions on the first application I did for the first teacher training that happened at Jivamukti. And it was, and some of you may not know this, but imagine applying now for a training program that had 100 questions, many of which had 10 parts. And that in order to get the answers to those questions, you had to be like a researcher, a journalist. You had to find the people that may know. And so, and the other interesting feature of that time was that, I couldn't afford to buy all the books, right? And so I used to kind of hang out as a work-study student who would look at the library of new books at Jivamukti, and I would, on my
they were all
pauses,
on the shelves, all the books in the training or whatever. Yeah.
And I would just start peeling through them and opening them up, right? And then there were those books that were most influential for me at the time. One of which was Light on Yoga, as the source, right, of how to name asanas, how to study. Well, how is because Iyengar saying we go into a pose, stay in a pose, come out of a pose, right? Because the process had already begun to become a teacher. So there was one thing to receive instruction, and it was something else to digest the experience that one was having, and then skillfully right? If you want to say lead others or guide others toward that, what I'm calling that experience, right? So the process of teaching for me was, okay, I have this experience. Can I recreate in teaching that state that was touched, that feeling that arose, that idea, that sprung forth? Can I recreate that and offer that? And so teaching just became a really simple process of doing the practice, wholeheartedly engaging in the practice. And then, before I even really knew what contemplation or self-inquiry was, digest that thing. Why did it happen that way? What transpired? And then, as I said, in some way, which may or may not have been skillful at the time, skillfully recreate.
Well,
so
I hear everything with you, and it matches my experience. You touched on a lot of different things. I do think that first Jivamukti teacher training is very significant. It marks a change, because it wasn't us going to India and meeting those gurus or whatever, getting the tap on the forehead or whatever it was that you did back then to get the okay from that teacher that you were authorized or whatever to be a teacher. And Jivamukti was a very exciting place. When I went there, at first it was a full-on hybrid. I met Leslie Kamenoff there. I met Allison West there. They had a very diverse teachers on staff. And then there was that very pivotal moment, which I've talked about on the show a bunch of times, where they developed like Jivamukti method. Like they developed what they felt was like their signature practice. And they did start their like training, which, as you said, was very rigorous. I remember I talked with Kachi, and she was in like the very first one, which was free. She didn't have to pay. But then I think the first paid one was when Lilia was in. Were you in it with Lilia?
Yes, we were in that one together.
I see. Because I remember talking with Lilia about that, and that was a very significant moment. And there was a kind of a shift there, because that's when they wanted everybody who was teaching to also come to the kirtans. And that's when Leslie and Allison left. They didn't like that. They didn't like that it was required that the teachers had to come to like other events than their classes or whatever. And they kind of struck out on their own a little bit. And that's kind of when I went with Allison's son. But I still went to Jiva all the time to study with Kachi. But
I do remember that. So, I mean, that visual, and you with Kachi and you there at that time is really clear. I left New York as that, after graduation, and that transition was happening in 97, where having graduated that first class, like the Jivamukti method could now proceed, because there were now, I think there were 18 of us trained teachers, plus the 6 that had been before, where there was a certain, here's the ground. And now this Jivamukti could go to Crunch, could go to Equinox, could go to, the different gyms around the city, and we could call our class Jivamukti. And then it was having gone through that, it was clear that the Jivamukti method, the Jivamukti school of yoga, was extending out. And it's interesting because as you mentioned, when I started there, my practice included the primary series every morning. So I can't even imagine the kind of energy I had then, because I would do the primary series from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then I would take the open class at 10 a.m. And then I would do an in-class private after that. And then I would come back for the 6 p.m. class. And then was the evening event, whether it was kirtan, meditation, or a scriptural study. So those few years of engaging in that way, for the most part, set for me like the foundation of, I'm living in New York City, I'm a yogi living in New York City, like somehow the background of New York City, whether, and this was just personal, like whether that was, friends, social, entertainment, going out, eating, doing, like all of that background sort of receded. And there was this place that I would go to every day, and that was not only the physical space, however, it was also how I made any other decision. And it was very, very interesting that it had that centering effect, that focal point effect on how I started actually living my life. So much now, there's so much lingo around like lifestyle and lifestyle this and lifestyle that, as if you're trying to get this information about how to live well from someone else who we see as
or it's a style or something,
living well. The thing that was really important about that time is that the thing itself that I was doing, in order to do that well, the lifestyle around it happened. And I feel like it's important to name that somehow at this moment in time as we talk about reimagining the classroom.
I couldn't agree more. I think that it's kind of where I was leading, and you went there because it was a different time, and you said it yourself in terms of the way you got information or the way that you were trained. So because of that, it happened over like that couple of years. Like I'm laughing so hard when you talk about going to all those classes, because I did it too. And I think back on it now, I'm like, that was crazy. Like how much time and energy, because New York was this crazy place. But I think that, we started this conversation by saying it's been 30 years, but the seeds were so firmly planted in those few years that I spent in that kind of dedicated study at that place on 2nd Avenue with those teachers. That's why I'm still in it like this 30 years later, because it was so impactful. And to your point, the last point that you made, that I agree, I was just in this training I'm doing now, which is the first training I've done in many years, because I swore doing teacher training off after I let go of my center, because there was so much dilemma in my mind about it, frankly, in terms of the way the money and all of it. And we can talk about that if we want, but like, I was so conflicted about the way that yoga teacher training had come to be the way that it was, that I swore it off for a long time. And in this new one that I've done, it's a year-long program. And I was just recently, we were considering meditation. And I was just realizing that I don't think I had any real experiential or kind of real understanding of some of these more subtler things like they point to in those like last 3 limbs or whatever, until recently, until 30 years, that like it takes things in your life getting in place to support whatever it is that we're learning about, whatever this print concept is or experiences or understanding of reality or your existence is. And so I really think that it's a good, important point that you're making, because that's the part of where things got kind of weird with teacher training, where it became this very abstracted thing that was about kind of learning objectives and bullet points for different poses, more than it having to be like you in your life just deciding what you're going to eat, or whatever it is, right?
Wow, talking about teacher trainings is an entirely it's a whole other podcast discussion. What I'll say here is, those of us that have been in it and recognized at some point that a teacher training or training teachers was where our teaching had come to, it's like, it's right now we have to take the responsibility for how that transaction allowed us to stay in it, meaning it gave us the resources, or it provided really the income to stay in it and to stay at it. What I will say is great, and we're still here and we're at it. What I believe reimagining the classroom is, and taking responsibility for that 15-year period of saturation in the yoga world and all of those trainings, is that yoga pedagogy, in my opinion, and this is a thesis, right, it started to take on educational processes that are and can be oppressive, hierarchical, problematic, in terms of where knowledge resides, where power resides, what or how we're saying, in a sense, here's this 200-hour training, we're going to do it in 3 months, so do as I say, not as I do. Just get this, like, memorize this, right? And so if we start to look at that in terms of problematizing how those trainings happened, we, on one hand, we can say, well, all of these teachers like stayed in it and were able to continue to do this work because this thing arose and the interest arose and the population grew to want to do this. At the same time, how or were we skillful in recognizing what pedagogically was taking place? And so reimagining the classroom is critical pedagogy, in my opinion. Reimagining the classroom is the time as an educator where we look at what we've done and that we're responsible as, you know, I don't want to use the word model as if pedestal or model as if, but we're responsible for how a next generation perceives our process, our success, where we've come to, because the conversation we started with was the foundation of practice. And then the conversation in teaching had far more to do for those periods of years about economics, right? It had to do with keeping a studio afloat.
Well, here's what I would say. Is I think you're onto something important, and you're framing it as a responsibility, which I think is interesting. What I think of it, and it does lead from where we were talking about in terms of our early experience to the conversation we're having today about reimagining the classroom, is that for those of us who rode the wave, and that's always the term I use. That's it. You're right. We rode the wave. Like, I supported myself as a yoga teacher for the last 30 years. That's crazy. That's bizarre.
It's extraordinary too.
And I know that that's not even as possible today as it was because of the timing of when we came into it or whatever. There was this moment, there was a wave that we rode. And I think that within that wave, many of us, people like yourself who were going to that many classes in the early 90s, who just were that impassioned by practice, we were always doing our best to maintain integrity throughout this 200 hours. We always, within the 200-hour frame, we're doing our darndest to do what you said earlier and see if we could facilitate those experiences that were so transformational to us. Whether we were teaching at Yoga Works or Core Power or wherever the hell people were doing teacher trainings, I hear stories of people saying, but my teacher trainer really did it, was there, you know what I mean? They managed to do it even within the limitations of the hours, which was really a problem once it became about hours. It was just like, I pay you for these hours, and then we were filling the hours. So I think that there was a real thing that's been happening for a lot of us as we've matured. I just turned 50, crazy. And, when I get to that and I'm saying, okay, if I'm going to keep calling myself a yoga teacher, I have to feel good about that. I have to feel authentic in that and feel like it's true to what it means to me to spend all my life doing this, So to maintain that authenticity, it has meant doing what you said, like evaluating the pedagogy that came before us and feeling some license, honestly, to break from those conventions in certain ways.
Absolutely.
Because in the early days, there was very clear, there was those gurus, and then there was the institutions that formed around them. And those were the sources of authority. And we know, I've had so many conversations on the show over the years about all the downfalls and all the collapses. And as you said, the change in conversation around like things that, and I know you're an Iyengar teacher in many ways at heart, in a very interesting way, because I've talked about there's a lot of Iyengar practitioners, because there is sort of experiences that people had with the Iyengar method at an earlier time, and then there's a standardization process that happened and things got bigger, and I just think that it's interesting to me that, I guess, before I go there, what I would ask you is, how do you, situate the practice and those teachers? Because I was going to say things that in the past would have happened that were just normal stuff that was often thought of as the teacher challenging you in certain ways. Like that teacher wasn't really angry at you. That teacher was just behaving that way to reveal to you limitations in yourself. And many people received it as that way and felt that they grew from that slap or that kick or whatever, that there was a certain somatic dominance about the way the teacher related to the student, and that was accepted and the convention and the way that it was. And I guess in our teachers, they still had some of that, and I think maybe we emulated it some for a while too, but then our generation are some of the ones who really were like, I don't feel comfortable that I don't have that direct thing with that guru. I don't feel okay about that, and had to like resituate myself. So I guess for yourself, I don't know how connected you are still to the Iyengar Association or Institute, or
Very
how
much.
you identify as a teacher, or how did you process some of those conversations with everything that happened with Pattabhi Jois, and then even conversations around Iyengar. I know he doesn't have the same stuff as Pattabhi Jois, but even in terms of like the way that he taught or the way he interacted with people.
Okay. Whew.
I know that's a lot. I just threw you a whole big mess, didn't I?
It's not a mess. It's, I think that, again, it's the subjective and it's the objective. And let me say a bit about that. Reimagining the classroom for me in the last 4 or 5 years was born out of a critical response to what was happening. And that included many different arenas. So one, I would say very specifically, was the social response. So that between social media and each handle you have and how many followers you have, you're either invited or not invited to participate in this conference or this thing, and that became, from a marketing perspective, prioritized in some cases around the skill of what it is that we're bringing. So let me just say that reimagining the classroom, I'm saying, for me, has had different components. So one component was that. Another component was I identify as a lineage holder. It's one of my identities, right? I identify as a lineage holder. And that I recognize as a lineage holder that there has been a lot of resistance in modern yoga, a lot of resistance in the last few years to what the guru-disciple relationship means and what it shaped or how it formed people within those, within the context of those methods, institutions, foundations, what that really means. So there's the social marketing bit, there's this guru-disciple relationship aspect of it. There is the maturing aspect of just me in my human, maturing, female, queer understanding that I had reached a point in my life where I was far more free and liberated in saying who I was and being who I was unapologetically, which I will say was a big piece, because having been a part of Indian traditions, going to India as frequently as I did, being a queer woman was something that was hidden. I was just always asked, like, why aren't you married? Are you married? Why aren't you married? It's like, I'm not married. And that was just the end of that. And then the next conversation or the stigma is, well, something's clearly wrong with her if that's not the chosen path. So I had to actually get to a place in my own maturity and age where it's like, this is who I am. Like, I'm so really grateful that there is a generation now that is coming to that conversation earlier. And I feel like it's a really important aspect of doing this work, which I will call liberatory pedagogy. Right. So at the foundation of our yoga life, and I don't know how this was for you, but at the foundation of those early years of kind of awakening to what I experienced as loosening the tension of the concepts that I had acquired, in my growing, the way I saw myself, like the practice of yoga did begin to liberate or untangle or kind of tease out who I thought I was based on, the first 20 years of my life. And that is another aspect that I want to come to, and I realize I'm kind of moving in a labyrinth to answer your question.
No, I always do that. So you're okay. That's the way they work in spirals. It's fine. We're going to come back on a bunch of stuff.
Okay. So I'll just repeat back. The social, marketing, economic. How we're situating yoga in terms of its being the largest growing $1 billion blah 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 industry too. And therefore, who are you in that, and what are you bringing to that for those that are going to engage in that transaction? The guru-disciple relationship, liberatory pedagogy, and the process which I believe is possible from moment one, from the first yoga class, from the beginner student, in the very moment that someone steps into a yoga classroom, that liberatory pedagogy is available. It can be resourced. It is a part of who they are already that they may not actually know. So,
I'm going to forgive me and stop you for a second, just to agree with that last bit and put a pin in that, because I think that's an important note that I am in agreement with. I guess what I want to go back to a little bit has to do with this pedagogical shift that we're pointing to.
I'm right there with you.
And specifically, this is what I will say to you, because I'm just going to read, I want to read what you wrote as the description for Reclaiming the Classroom, because I think it's why I reached out to you, because it says, we've arrived at a moment to co-create a new space for learning, a space that embodies the qualities and values that are fundamental to healing, space that's committed to the voices, perspectives, and life experience of each learner. And the learning space must be a dialogical one, which is interesting. You chose the word dialogical. I've been using co-creative, which you also use. That was my whole thing going into this training, is like, I can't be I have the knowledge and then you're going to pay me thousands of dollars and then I will give it to you, because that is not how the nature of this knowledge is transmitted. That there's a co-creation, and it goes back to our early years where there wasn't all this structured and all this standardization. It was self-directed. We had to make it happen. You show up to class. for a year or two before your teacher then said, okay, you're covering for me. And then you were a teacher. Like, I always make that joke, but it was true because it wasn't about hours. It was about practice and competency that you were able to have demonstrated to that teacher over time, and a relationship often that you would have. But I do think that relationship has changed. Like, I think back to how I looked at certain teachers I had that I really respected and how I was nervous around them, or what the relationship was with them. Like, I never talked with Sharon and David. Like, I don't know. I was very like, and I think about how I am attempting to relate, or how I am relating to people who are studying with me now. And it's such a different dynamic. It's much more what I think of as like a mutual co-creative place where I'm going to bring everything I'm going to bring, but it's your practice. So you have to bring yourself to it. We have to meet in the middle, which is the difference. So I guess when I got to be honest, when I think of Iyengar method, I don't necessarily think of what you wrote in your description, because I know you said you're a lineage holder.
Okay, you ready?
Yes.
This is the beautiful tension. Really, it's a dynamic tension in my being, and it's actually a tension that has and is continuing to kind of bear fruit. And so let me say to you that I am very much that person who, from like some of the early seeds planted at Jivamukti around moving through discomfort, moving through your pain, holding something longer than you thought you could bear it. Like, I took that on. Right? Like, I took that on as a way of practice. So just know those are like early seeds. And when I came to Iyengar Yoga, which actually happened at Jivamukti because there were Iyengar Yoga teachers that taught the basics classes there, and people who had then kind of got, their influences were Iyengar Yoga, and they were still teaching at Jivamukti. So there wasn't a time where like Iyengar Yoga was sort of separate from how I was learning. It was all part of the early influence.
It was a gold standard when vinyasa was coming about. Iyengar Yoga was considered a gold standard, and it was still considered making vinyasa safer and all that other stuff. You know. Yeah. Well,
you would attend to the. Not only the detail and the instruction, but you would attend to that, and then sort of say, how am I gonna use this in order to be able to do this? Right. And so I had a specific moment just in my own education where the population of students that were in front of me were not Jivamukti students that had the same access to moving the body at a certain speed. Even stepping forward from downward facing dog to a lunge, right, was not something that was as accessible to the bodies that I was working with. So Iyengar Yoga being a direction or even a way that I started to practice was a very organic response. And this is how I use the word responsibility. It's like how we listen to what's in front of us and say, well, I can't just plow through, Surya Namaskar A or B in this circumstance, because there are probably about 10 things that would need to happen prior to getting one cycle of Surya Namaskar to happen. And that was just my idea. That was, and how do I know that? Feedback. I know that from the population I worked with saying, we can't do that. Oh, you're just a drill sergeant, Nikki. You just tell us to do things, but we can't do this. So tell us what to do before that, or instead of that, or how to modify that or change that. So what is already happening in this process that I'm describing as an organic one is that I began to seek out Iyengar Yoga fundamentally as a teacher at that time, because I didn't feel I had.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.